Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jet Smith and I'm the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho. And this is a topic lecture video for the new February 2026 public forum debate resolution that reads, resolved, the Federal Trade Commission should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. So in this video, we'll talk about a couple different things. First, we're going to analyze the resolution just to make sure that we understand what it means. This portion of the video is going to be a little bit longer than usual because I think that this topic requires a lot of understanding of its writing and its background to be debatable. And then we'll go over 10 pro and then 10 con arguments. So first up, what are we going to talk about with analyzing the resolution? We'll break it down into trichotomy, or what type of topic is it. We'll go over key definitions of the different phrases in the topic. We'll go over background information or recent historical trends that you should be aware of. We'll discuss how to debate policy topics in public forum debate, because I think that's important to this resolution. We'll talk about stakeholders, or the groups that are most affected and would be the most interested in the outcome of this topic. And then we'll talk about the core issues involved, or the main areas of disagreement and clash that are likely to come up between the pro and the con. Before I move on, I'd ask that you please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, do what you got to do to help drive up the engagement so that I can keep making videos like this for you. The next video that will most likely come out would be an analysis of the March-April Lincoln Douglas debate topic and the March public forum debate topic. So first up, let's talk trichotomy, which is, what type of topic is it? Again, we have the Federal Trade Commission should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. Now, this is a policy topic as it has an actor, the FTC, the word should, and an action, which is to establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. Now, something to understand is that the FTC, which we'll talk about more on definitions, or the Federal Trade Commission, is an executive agency, but it is an independent agency. And so it was created by Congress. The commissioners that help lead it are nominated by the president, but there is not like a head of the Department of Education, for example, for the FTC, like there is for those other executive branch agencies. So usually the FTC only acts when Congress directs it to do so. And having talked with someone who was on the public forum topic wording committee, they said that the intention of the writing was that normal means, or how we would just assume that the topic would happen hypothetically, is that the FTC would be doing this framework on the basis of a law passed by Congress. And so that is kind of the actor of the resolution, is the FTC, but at the behest of Congress. So now let's talk definitions. First up, what is sports betting? Because that's kind of what the whole topic is about, and that's probably the part of the topic that is most simple. It is essentially gambling or wagering money on the outcomes of collegiate and or professional athletic or competitive contests. Now, a couple things that you need to know underneath that. Sports books are the venues or companies or platforms where you actually go to do the gambling. So the casino word for the sports betting is the sports books. And that is where you can place wagers on sporting event outcomes. How do the companies make money? They do this through the VIG, or the vigorish, which is a charge or fee that they attach to every bet, and it's factored into the odds. And they often place a VIG on both sides of the bet, so that no matter which one happens, if this team wins or loses, or if the point spread is this big or this small, that they'll at least get some money no matter what. And there are different types of sports bets, including the money line bet, which is essentially a win or loss bet, where if you are betting on their money line, then you will win money if they win. And if they lose, then you will lose. Then we also have other types of bets, like the point spread bet. And the point spread bet is more a prediction of how far the gap between winning and losing is going to be. So is it going to be a 30-7 score, or is it going to be a 16-13 score? And so the point spread bet is different. Another type of bet we have is over under, which is just the total amount of points that are going to be scored between both teams. So if you predict 40, is 40 above, equal to, or less than what the two teams' scores put together were at the end of the game? So if this team scored 30 and this team scored 10, and you bet over under 40, then you would win the money. Or if you said that it will be over 30, then you'd win. If you said it'd be under 30, then you'd lose. We also have a parlay bet, which is essentially a bet on a bunch of small different things happening. So you only really win if you get the entire parlay. So, for example, you bet that Team A is going to beat Team B, that Team C is going to beat Team D, and that Team C is also going to be ranked the number 3 seed, and also that this person is going to be given MVP. And if you get every single one of those things correct, then you can get a lot of money for only spending a little bit. But unless you get everything on the parlay, then you don't really make your money back or make any profit off of it. We also have proposition bets, or prop bets as they're most frequently referred to. And that is where you are betting on individual events. So you are betting on an individual player's performance, on how many goals they're going to score, or on how many yards they're going to rush for. Or on specific events. So a parlay or a prop bet could be that this team will have scored at least 10 points by 5 minutes into the game, right? So a prop bet is on individual events, not necessarily winning or losing. And you're making a prediction about whether something does or doesn't occur, or when it occurs, or things like that. Futures bets are wagers on overall future outcomes down the road. So what is this team's overall record going to be at the end of the season? Who is going to be the overall MVP of the league? Who is going to make it to the Super Bowl, right? So those are futures bets. And then we have live betting, which is betting that is happening during the game or after the game has already started, where you are adapting and making predictions on the fly with what's going on around you. Now, there's a similar concept known as prediction markets. And prediction markets, some would say that they are sports betting. Some would say that they are different. There are cards that conflate them, but there are lots of cards that say that they are two different things. States are trying to say that they are the same thing, and the Supreme Court is currently possibly going to take that up as a case. It's being it's being adjudicated in lower circuit courts right now. But a prediction market is basically where you are contracting with your prediction on a yes-no basis. So win-lose. This team is going to beat this team. If you think yes, then you are going to essentially enter into a contract via the website or the platform you're using with somebody who bets on the opposite side. And so the service is finding you somebody who will predict on the opposite side as you. Prediction markets are actually growing a lot, and people are wagering or stock market trading on predictions about the future. Like, there were people who were placing not bets, but trading future predictions on how many streams the new Taylor Swift album Life of a Showgirl was going to get. But the majority of prediction market trading is based on sports outcomes. The difference is that rather than charging a VIG, there is a transaction fee. So every time you put in money, every time you take money out, they take a certain cut of it, which is different than the amount that the house collects depending on how the bets go with a sports betting system. The other key distinction that I think makes it so that it will be pretty easy to say that this is not part of the topic is that these are regulated by the Commodity Futures Trade Commission, or the CFTC, not to be confused with this topic, which is the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. So you'd have to win that this counts as sports betting and that it should be the FTC regulating it, not the CFTC, in order for arguments about why regulating or not regulating prediction markets would be good or bad for the pro or con. But it is similar. You just have to make sure that when you're doing your research, you're not finding cards that are about prediction markets. You are finding cards that are about sports betting. Next up, let's talk about the Federal Trade Commission, or the main actor in this resolution. It's an independent government agency that was created by Congress, and it has a couple of purposes, mostly to prevent anti-competitive, deceptive, and unfair business practices that protect consumers who buy the products, and also protect competition. And that is the main goals of the FTC. Now, how does it do this? Well, it enforces its rules or regulations that build upon directives given to it by Congress through civil penalties, lawsuits, cease and desist orders, getting financial compensation for consumers who have been harmed, providing education to consumers or to workers, blocking mergers of huge companies. Typically, the FTC only really ever acts in response to public or private or media reports or complaints that have been filed, or if it has been asked to do something by Congress. So what would most likely happen if we vote affirmative or if we vote pro is that it would use its powers from Article 5 and Article 18 of the Federal Trade Commission Act after being asked by Congress with a new piece of legislation to look into and to make some rules about sports betting on a nationwide level. Now, the FTC has three major bureaus. Technically, there's two smaller bureaus underneath it, and they are the Bureau of Consumer Protection, the Bureau of Competition, and the Bureau of Economics. The Bureau of Consumer Protection is all about consumer privacy, fighting identity theft, regulating advertising and marketing practices, and protecting people from fraud. And it steps in to look at things with marketing and advertising and products that are deception or unfairness. Deception meaning when representations, omissions, or practices by companies in their marketing are likely to mislead a reasonably intelligent consumer into buying a product or service. And unfairness is when they are doing something unethical or unscrupulous, violating public policy, causing harm to consumers. So that side of the FTC is looking out for consumers. Then we have the Bureau of Competition, which is about enforcing antitrust or anti-monopoly, anti-duopoly, anti-oligopoly laws, and trying to protect market competition. So it investigates mergers or when companies are trying to form one, agreements that they make, trying to make sure that it's fair enough that there can be lots of different businesses in each economic industry because they don't want there to only be one. And then the Bureau of Economics helps both of the other two bureaus by looking into the rules that they're considering or the things that are happening and seeing what the economic impact is so that they can make the decision that's overall the most economically viable about the rules that they pursue. So that's more about the FTC. So now when we put these two things together, we have to think, okay, so the FTC is doing something with sports betting, but the thing that they are doing is not extremely clear on a first glance or even on a second glance. So federal regulatory framework is a phrase that you will find in a lot of different articles. It is not a phrase that you will find defined almost anywhere. The only thing that I could find that sort of defined it was from a sort of sketchy website that I swear every 5 seconds was trying to give me a pop-up ad, and I could only open up the article by quickly hitting Control A and then Control C to copy it. But it says that it was published on March of 2025, and it technically has a section defining things. But it could be AI generated. I think that the source needs to be looked into more, but I searched and searched and searched. And seriously, it was the only thing that I could find that actually defined federal regulatory framework. And in a nutshell, the article talks about how it is the components that all come together for how rules are developed, implemented, and enforced by the centralized or federal government. This includes regulatory agencies, rulemaking processes, enforcement mechanisms, and dispute resolution. And overall, that is kind of what a federal regulatory framework comes together to mean. Now, this is a term that is thrown around everywhere in the literature. People who complain about government bureaucracy or who talk about agencies in the government use this phrase all the time, despite the fact that it doesn't really have a set meaning. And so every other article that you're going to find that uses this phrase, if it even sort of defines it, it's not really a definition. It's just explaining what it means by federal regulatory framework in this specific field. So for example, it might say, in environmental law, this process happens by this agency with this rule under the current federal regulatory framework. And so it's not really defining what that phrase means. It's just saying, in the context of this policy area, here's what a federal regulatory framework is. There are some cards that use the phrase federal regulatory framework and also talk about sports betting. Almost always it's in the context of this new law was just proposed, which would establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. Here are some of the law's provisions, which doesn't really define what a federal regulatory framework is. It just says, okay, this legislation's interpretation of a federal regulatory framework would be this, and this, right? The most simple way, if you want to just try and skirt defining this in a complicated way, is to just look at how the FTC regulates tobacco and the tobacco industry and be like, okay, could they do that with sports betting? And the answer is yes. And that is what a lot of people have proposed. That is the most simple way, I think, of explaining a federal regulatory framework. You know how, you don't see smoking advertisements on television anymore. Every box of cigarettes has warnings on the side of it about how it can cause cancer and it can be addictive. There's all of these taxes that they have to follow. There's all of these standards that you have to apply. There's a minimum age in order to be able to buy tobacco. All of those types of things could be applied as part of a federal regulatory framework to sports betting. But I've attached a couple of different links to articles that are talking specifically about sports betting. One of them is technically about daily fantasy sports, which is a form of sports betting, and they all use the phrase federal regulatory framework in context. So if you want a more context-specific definition, or if that first card turns out to be pretty bogus or sketchy to use, then I would use one of these other three. So all these phrases put together, because we can't really define any word individually, we have to look at the different phrases of the resolution. Now that you know what the Federal Trade Commission does and you know what sports betting is, you have to ask yourself, okay, what would a federal regulatory framework about sports betting created and enforced by the FTC include? And the problem is there is no direct answer on that. There is no one card that is going to tell you that. There is no one definition that is going to answer that clearly and say, this is what is included, this is what is not included. The people who are advocating for federal regulation or a federal regulatory framework on sports betting do not all agree on why we need one or what they should include or what their purpose would be. There are certain industries like the MLB and the NBA have both been asking for a federal regulatory framework for years, but obviously what they're asking for would be very different than what the average consumer would be asking for, or what somebody who is working in addiction recovery would be asking for. So there are a bunch of different reasons why people would want a federal regulatory framework, and they do not always go together. And so that means that for every goal, there is a lot of different policies that would be included as part of the regulatory framework, and a lot of different arguments used to justify those different regulations, oftentimes that are contradictory. Sometimes the regulatory framework that is proposed is to make it easier for sports betting companies to operate, and sometimes it's to make it harder. Sometimes the regulatory framework is about restoring competition because there's an almost monopoly with some really powerful companies. Sometimes the regulatory frameworks proposed are all about consumers and advertising. And so if you just say regulatory framework, well, is it a pro sports betting or a anti quote unquote sports betting? Is it about advertising, or is it about affordability, or is it about, antitrust, right? So in a 4-minute speech, you cannot explain every single policy that could be included in a regulatory framework, let alone list them, let alone make an argument for why every single one of them is good or why every single one of them is bad. And yet every argument you make, you need to have a specific example in your link of the regulation that could be used to achieve this, or different types of regulations that could be used to achieve this, either that have been proposed for sports betting or that have been used for other things that the FTC has regulated. So next up, let's talk about the background information that you need to know for this topic to make sense now that we know what the definitions mean. So what is sports betting like now? Sports betting is legalized in 38 to 41 states. Every article says something different, and I could not figure out what the definite number was at this moment, but it's around 80% of states essentially have sports betting legalized. Idaho is not one of them. But around 75% of those that have legalized it, so around 30 to 32, offer sports betting not just in person, like at the venue or at a casino, but also online or on smartphone apps. But interstate wagers, so betting on something in a company in another state with an event happening in another state, is illegal because of the Federal Wire Act. So most of the betting has to happen within your own state. Now, most betting that occurs, most of the money that happens with the NFL, with football or basketball in the NBA or baseball in the MLB are like the top ones. But NCAA college sports and even esports or video game competitive sports is also getting more and more popular for betting. Now, the total value of this is estimated just in legal bets to be between 160 to 170 billion last year in 2025, and that number is predicted to go up even more this year. So sports betting is huge and it's almost everywhere, but it wasn't even legal in the United States really until 2018. So for that, it's grown so huge in such a short period of time is kind of proof of how timely this is. And in public forum, we want to look at current events. A little bit more to know about the Federal Trade Commission. It has regulated a lot of things, and it has a lot of like accomplishments or things that it has protected. It's also failed at a lot of things. But here are some things that we have the FTC to thank or blame. We don't really have to worry about junk fees getting added. People have to be very clear about fees that they add to products and services. Mandating click to cancel with subscriptions. You have to be able to cancel a subscription just by clicking a button, or to cancel a transaction with clicking something because of the FTC. They've blocked huge mergers between ginormous companies like the DraftKings and FanDuel merger, which are the two biggest sports betting companies. They have also sued to block unfair drug patents to help reduce prescription drug costs. They've banned non-compete clauses for employees in certain industries where you used to have to sign in your employment contract that you couldn't go work for another company in the same field if you ever quit for them. And that can't happen because of the FTC. There's different consumer data requirements for protecting your data, for securing your data, for what they're allowed to collect, for what they have to tell you because of the FTC, ensuring the right to repair, the idea that you have to be legally allowed to fix your own products and not have to go to the company who sold it to you to fix it. They've done a lot to help small businesses compete. And it's supposed to be an independent government agency created by Congress, nominated with 5 commissioners who are like the board of directors by the president. There's supposed to be at least 2 members of the commissioners from the opposition party, so not the party of the president. So there should never be more than 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, or 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. There can be independents, so it could be 2-2-1 or 2-1-1 or something like that. But the problem is that Trump fired both of the Democrats, and there's only 2 conservatives currently acting as commissioners. And that, if you've heard all the stuff about, Doge and firing people from the government, even if technically they're not supposed to be allowed to be fired because it's an apolitical position and you can only fire them if they're being like criminally negligent, not just because they're not from your own party. Well, Trump fired them anyways, and then now has been sued, and there's a Supreme Court case that will be decided by June about whether or not Trump is allowed to do that. But the FTC is supposed to be independent and kind of apolitical, and it's not very independent or apolitical right now. Next up, we talked earlier about the definition of a federal regulatory framework and how it could mean a lot of different things. And when I say it could mean a lot of different things, I mean a lot of different things. So what I've done is I've tried to simplify from all of the different pieces of legislation, all of the different articles that I've read, where anybody has used the phrase federal regulatory framework or framework for federal regulations or anything similar, what policies have they actually been proposing? And there are a lot of them, and I grouped them into 5 categories: marketing restrictions, consumer safeguards, sports integrity, athlete education mandates, economic competition, and unifying standards nationwide. In market restrictions, this includes things like regulating the language that they're allowed to use, or in advertisements that are misleading, like, for example, risk-free or no sweat bets or bonus bets that are all not real, or terms that are meant to make you think that you're going to be fine, but then you're not fine and you still can lose a lot of money. Time or content curfews, like you can't show sports gambling advertisements from like 8 a.m. through 10 p.m. or maybe it's 8 a.m. through or 10 a.m. through 8 p.m. Or that you can't show them past a certain time or on certain days. There could be requirements that they, on any advertisement, have to disclose the odds of your winning on whatever it is that they're advertising right there. They could regulate that they have to display the addiction hotline at all times, anytime that there's an advertisement going on. There's also endorsement oversight, or if they endorse certain athletes or if celebrities or, take money from these companies, that has to be done through a specific way and transparently reported. There's also proposals to have clean broadcast options, where you have to be able to offer a version of the thing you're streaming or the thing that you're televising, the sporting event, that doesn't have any sports gambling advertisements on it. So you'd have to be able to have an option for consumers to watch the football game where they're not going to see any advertisements with sports betting stuff, which might be pretty difficult without blurring some things out, because they're everywhere. They're in person, they're advertisements digitally, but also the court itself is branded in, betting stuff. There's whole segments of football games that are like sponsored by DraftKings or sponsored by FanDuel, right? The next group of federal regulatory framework areas is consumer safeguards. And remember, each of these areas has a lot of different policies, but it also is a different priority. So the first federal regulatory framework priority could be, we want to focus on the marketing or the advertising, and they would do that through like the Bureau of Consumer Protection. This next one would also probably be through the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and that is worrying more about like the individual people that are buying this product or engaging in this service. So affordability checks, where you'd have to be able to attach some sort of banking data to make sure that you can afford to continue spending money on this. Deposit and payment limit, saying that you can only deposit up to this much money up to this many times per day, on the website to prevent people from spending too much money. There's also loss-inducing features, which are pretty much guaranteed to always lose, but help the house, or that are designed to like get people to lose over and over and over again, making them think you're just around the corner before you win again, that we could ban. You could also make it illegal for them to take deposits to bet from a credit card, that it has to come from money that is actually in someone's account, not money that they don't have or that they're borrowing from somewhere else, because that can get people into really bad debt. There's also consumer privacy protections of the data that you have to give up to these companies that they collect on you. Should they be able to take that data? What should they do with the data? How should they have to protect that data? Things like that. Third regulatory framework area would be the integrity of sports, which is worrying about how sports betting as an industry is affecting outcomes for coaches, athletes, teams, games, and things like that. So we have had a lot of people propose a national repository or a clearinghouse of wagering data, where all of the data of how much money is being spent, when it's being spent, where it's being sent to, should all be put in, a location that anyone can see. Not that it would have your name attached to it, but if we had all of the data in a federal database, then it would make it way easier to go in and investigate. Oh, there's all these large sums of money that are coinciding with this team that was doing really well all of a sudden losing, or this team that was doing terrible all of a sudden winning, or this athlete all of a sudden gave up partway through a game, and look at that, like at the same day they received this huge sum of money. So there could be a national data collection service about sports betting as part of this. They could also attach criminal penalties to of fraud for any ref or coach or person who is caught like throwing games or fixing games or anything like that to try and win bets for themselves or for other people. There could be mandatory like educational services offered to student athletes to teach them about sports betting and about how it can impact them, whether they choose to do it or not, and how to respond when people are harassing them based off of, the bets. You could ban insider betting, where nobody who's in the industry is allowed to bet on anything at all. The NCAA has said that college athletes are now allowed to bet on professional sports, but not NCAA sports. There's also things like banning prop betting or individual performance betting, where right now you can say, okay, I think that this quarterback is going to throw this many touchdowns this game, and that can create problems. So there's people who say we should make it illegal to bet on individual players' performances. So those are all things that we could do to maintain the integrity of sports. Then we have regulatory frameworks that are designed to promote economic competition. So it's more about protecting the sports betting industry or small businesses within the sports betting industry than it is about directly the consumers. So it's not necessarily anti-sports betting, it's anti the same two companies doing all of the sports betting. So this could be antitrust oversight, scrutinizing mergers or any time that companies want to come together, trying to harmonize licensing agreements or tax rates across the different states to help smaller companies. I think that in one state it's like $5,000 to get licensed as a sports betting company or a sports booker, or sports books, and it's in Illinois like 20,000 or 20 million. Like it's a huge discrepancy between them. And so making that more standardized could help create competition so that small businesses could get their start in other states. There's also like planning and setting the like maximum or minimum amount that these companies are allowed to put on the VIG, or how much, they're supposed to get taxed. So we could, all of those things might help create a floor for regulations at the state level that promotes better economic competition and small to medium-sized sports betting companies. Then we have unifying standards nationwide. So this is a regulatory framework where the main problem is they're like, look, we like sports betting. We don't like the fact that every state does it differently because it makes it really complicated. It makes it really confusing. It makes it really expensive. So there are things like a national self-exclusion list, which would basically say that somebody would be able to go to the federal government and be like, I want to be added to a list that prevents me from gambling anywhere in the country. And a lot of people who have gambling addiction put themselves in their state's no gambling list, but then they can get around it by just traveling to another state. That would not be possible if there was a nationwide exclusion list. Standardized betting age would be saying that like in every state across the country, the minimum age that you can do sports betting is 18 or 19 or 20 or 21, because every state kind of does it differently right now. You could also talk about basically banning it unless you apply, so that like the federal government would say, unless you were given an exemption through an application, sports betting is illegal, so that the states have to constantly be reapplying and better monitoring, and they would be accountable to the federal government. There'd be more transparency. You could also go in the opposite direction and say, right now, the Federal Wire Act says that you can't have interstate wagers on sports betting. You could, as part of the federal regulatory framework and the act passed by Congress, amend the Federal Wire Act to allow for those interstate wagers. So this group is not as anti-sports betting as the other areas are. But as you can see, it's pretty unlikely that a federal regulatory framework would include every single one of these things, or even if it was only a marketing restriction framework, that it would include all of those policies. And so sometimes bills have picked a couple of things from different areas, but everybody who says they want regulation of sports betting wants it for different reasons and therefore wants different policies. And even if they want the same policy, they read different arguments on behalf of those policies. So in addition to this, you should know the recent legislation that has been proposed around sports betting. Now, there have been a lot of different laws, but none of them have been passed. None of them have made it like 3 steps through the legislative process, to be honest with you. And that's partially because the gambling and the gaming industry lobbies hard to get people not to pass these things. But the PROTECT Act is an act that would ban proposition bets on student athletes on their individual performance. The Safe Bet Act is like the core of the topic. I think that is like the biggest, most well-known, largest bill with the most amount of meat in it that got the most media attention. And it includes a lot of different things like times that you can't have advertisements going or blackout times, a ban on AI-driven micro bets that are learning about the person who's using the app to know exactly when to give them something to get them to bet again, banning proposition bets on college sports, prohibiting you from using a credit card to bet with, implementing nationwide affordability checks and things like that. There's also the Betting on Our Future Act, which is mostly about advertising. The Kids Online Safety Act includes provisions that would prevent or make it really difficult for companies to market sports betting to minors. Protecting Athletes, Schools, and Sports Act, which would ban prop betting on college athletes and also ban name, image, and likeness deals with sports betting companies. And then Gambling Addiction Recovery Investment Treatment Act, which would basically say legalize but tax sports betting more and then give the money to states, and they have to use the money to provide gambling treatment. These are just a couple of examples that have all been from pieces of legislation that have been brought up within the last couple of years, but there's already been laws since these ones that have been proposed, and there were lots of laws before that one that have been proposed, all since 2018 when the Supreme Court case came out. There is a list of several of these bills with links to the text of them in the link that I've attached on this slide. Lastly, under background, and I know that there's a lot, but you got to know this stuff for the topic to make sense and to be able to phrase your cases in a way that will stand the test of time. You need to think about the court or the judicial legal landscape that we're looking at. So back in 2018, the Supreme Court case Murphy versus NCAA invalidated or struck down a federal law that banned sports betting nationwide. The Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional, that the federal government was overstepping its bounds. I'm pretty sure on the basis of like violating the 10th Amendment, that any rights not given to the federal government are left to the states. And right now, the Supreme Court is also looking at another case, Trump v. Slaughter, which is looking at whether or not he can fire those 2 Democratic commissioners without following the regulations that are supposed to protect people from getting fired just because they're from a different party. But we won't know that decision until June. Courts are also now looking at lawsuits targeting market prediction, which remember is when it's just like yes, no. And instead of you betting against the company is just linking you up with somebody who's betting on the opposite side as you. And then you enter into a contract that basically says, if we win, give me money. If you win, I give you money. And they take a transaction fee. The problem is that is not governed by the state laws on sports betting. So even though only 38 to 41 states have legalized sports betting, and most of them don't even really or have laws that are talking about the market prediction stuff, in all 50 states, even from things in other states, you can currently do a market prediction future trade, which is essentially sports betting, and get around the laws. But the company that is mostly doing that market prediction with sports, Kalshi, is getting sued, and it's not to the Supreme Court yet, but it seems decently likely that it will make its way there. But it's working through lower courts now. So just kind of pay attention and do research throughout the month to see if anything comes out about those lawsuits. The biggest problem with that is that it is under the jurisdiction, like I said earlier, of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, not the Federal Trade Commission. So the pro can't really claim to fix it unless they could find a card that says we should move that out of the CFTC and into the FTC, and that it is sports betting. The con can use this as a huge alternative solvency deficit to say, even if you put all these regulations on sports betting, you're not doing anything to be able to stop the market prediction stuff. The pros' response to that could also include, no, the courts are going to block that and strike it down because it's basically sports betting. So it could be a good con argument in terms of defense, or like a trade-off of you're just going to push people out of sports betting and into market future predictions, which are even worse for whatever reason. But it also might not matter. I just don't think that the pro can topically claim easily that they're going to ban that, for example. So now let's talk about policy topics in public forum debate. I know that we're still on the background section, whereas by now the video might have been over on other topics, but there is just so much that you have to understand about this one. And I think that includes how the topics are worded. Now, normally policy debate topics or actor action topics are pretty common in public forum, but they used to sound a lot more like plans that would be read under a policy debate resolution, like the cross-examination 8-minute long speeches debate. But now they're just phrased as the same as a policy topic, just slightly shorter. So if this public forum topic was a year-long policy topic, I think that it would sound something like this. The United States federal government should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting in one or more of the following areas: advertising, affordability, antitrust, athletes, and/or proposition bets. Now, plans under that topic, because in policy debate, every round the affirmative reads a plan that essentially proves the topic true by example. So you don't defend the entire topic or even one area of the topic. You pick an example of the topic to prove it. And the negative just has to be ready for whatever it is. So plans could be examples of the United States federal government should establish time and content restrictions on sports betting advertisements, or the USFG should ban proposition bets on collegiate athletes. That is what policy or actor action public forum debate topics have sounded like for the last couple of years. But now, instead of choosing what would be a specific plan under a large policy debate topic, they took the large policy debate topic and just slightly simplified it, but it is still huge. The problem is, unlike in policy debate, you cannot read a plan even when it is a huge generic policy topic. Saying we should establish a federal regulatory framework means nothing if you do not know what that federal regulatory framework means, because the reasons to establish it or not establish it are completely different depending upon what is in that regulatory framework. But you're not allowed to read a plan in public forum. So if you specify exactly what is in the regulatory framework and you're reading a plan, then you are going to get in trouble for that. You also can't rely on all of these things that the negative can rely on, where the negative can rely on the fact that the AF always speaks first, so they can react to whatever the affirmative plan was. They only have to debate one plan at a time. You don't have to prove why every example of a regulation could be bad in each debate in policy debate. The negative has to be prepared to debate anything, but once the debate starts, they're only debating the one affirmative plan. But in public forum, your opponent could be reading arguments from completely different regulations that have nothing to do with each other, and you'd have to be ready to answer every single one of them in every single round. Also, in policy, they're only debating this topic, and they're debating that topic for the entire year, and they know that that's the topic in January, and so of the previous year, whereas you only get like a month to prepare for this topic, knowing that it's for sure being chosen, or like 6 months if you started preparing for it when you weren't for sure it was going to get picked all the way back in June. So also, you can't read counter plans as the con that are like, generic counter plans of like an advantage counter plan that solves the exact same thing that the pro does, but kind of different with a net benefit. You can't do that in public forum debate. So the affirmative debate also has an advantage in policy where they don't have to defend the entire resolution. They don't have to defend, if this was a policy topic, every single regulation that could be established. They get to just pick one, but they can't do that either. So the negative could be reading arguments about why regulations D through F are bad when the pro case is only about regulations A through C. And that would never happen in policy debate. So I think both sides are kind of in a tough situation, because if the pro is too specific, they'll get accused of reading a plan. But if they're not specific enough, they're going to have to be forced to defend against disadvantages that they have no offense for on the other side of the regulation, right? When you're the pro in policy, when you're the AF, if you were like, okay, our plan is all about advertising, then they're going to read reasons why restricting advertising is bad, but your case is all about reasons why advertising is good. This could be a debate where the con stands up first and their whole case is about why antitrust regulation is bad, and your whole case is about why consumer affordability protection is good. And their case, you cannot just use your case to be like, yeah, but like we outweigh, because they could be like, okay, sure, but the overall regulatory framework would still include this. Meanwhile, the con is going to struggle because either the pro will be too specific and therefore their arguments won't apply. So the pro could say, sure, we should establish a federal regulatory framework, just not the ones you're talking about, and we win. Or the pro will be extremely vague, but if the pro is extremely vague and won't defend any specific regulations, then it will be impossible to nail down any of your arguments to exactly what, voting pro does. And they'll just be like, well, maybe not that one, or maybe not that one, right? And you can't read a counterplan, so you kind of have to defend the status quo. So if the pro proves that the status quo is pretty terrible, then and the stuff they're describing and critiquing in the status quo has nothing to do with the regulations that you are praising not existing in the status quo, like they're about completely different regulatory areas, then I think the judge is going to be pretty persuaded to vote pro because, yeah, voting pro isn't going to hurt antitrust because that's not their regulatory framework. So how do we get around this? What is the plan? What are we going to do? You have a couple of different options, each of which focus on a different part of the prep process, and therefore they're going to lead to different strategies in the debate. You need to be a little bit prepared for each of these because other people are going to focus their prep on these different areas. But I wouldn't say, unless like debate is your entire life, you eat, sleep, breathe it, you have a ton of help, you have a ton of teammates, you have a ton of coaching, that it's going to be viable to do all three of these things for a 1 month long topic. But I think the three areas that you can focus your prep are either on the topicality or the resolutionary analysis prep approach, or the understanding the topic side and the preparing to debate about what the topic means side. So you are going to be uber prepared to win your definition or your interpretation of what sports betting regulatory framework means, so that if other people want to read arguments about other regulations, you're like, that's not what the topic is about. The topic is about these regulations. Here's our definition. We're ready to win that, right? So then even if you don't know as much about their regulations, you can prove that you don't need to know about them because they're not what the topic's about. The second strategy is to focus on the contention or the offensive prep approach. If you love writing cases, if you love writing new contentions, then this is the one for you, because the idea is you want to prepare to win no matter what your opponent says the regulatory framework would include or not include, because you would have an argument for every single approach, every single purpose of a regulatory framework. And then the third approach is more on like the ending part of the debate, which is the weighing and the comparative prep approach. And this is where you are prepared to say, okay, we will defend as the pro any regulations like happening that we would want to happen, and any regulations that the con says that they don't want to happen. Let's pretend like they would all happen in the pro world, even if they have nothing to do with each other. And we'll just explain why our regulation A is worth passing regulation B, or as the con, why regulation D is not worth regulation C. So you're not really saying we're going to tailor our argument to be ready for any regulation possible, or we're not going to prepare to debate the topic only as these regulations. We're just going to say, okay, we'll debate about whatever regulations you want, pretend like they all pass or none of them pass, and we're going to prove that it's worth it or not worth it. So the topicality approach, or the focusing on analyzing the resolution approach, if you are on the pro and this is your approach, you need to be avoiding being accused of reading a plan by defining federal regulatory framework. We're not reading a plan, we're reading a definition. So you can do this by using one of the articles that talks about a formally proposed bill in Congress that used the exact phrase federal regulatory framework, and basically say, okay, voting pro would result in any, for example, of these regulations from this bill being passed. So you're not saying our plan is to pass this legislation, you're saying the definition of a regulatory framework as provided by this bill could include all of these different things. I would not define it as one regulation, because a federal regulatory framework probably includes a lot of different rules and punishments and things like that. But if you can give at least 3 to 5 examples from recent news articles or recent pieces of legislation that a reasonably prepared debater could be expected to have read before, and be like, these are all things that could or would happen if you voted pro. The worst case scenario, if they accuse you of reading a plan or being too specific, you just say, okay, any argument that you want to read, just that, like, you can read it and we will defend that that happens in the pro world, as long as it is tied to a specific criticism of a proposed regulatory framework. So if they're reading arguments and none of their cards talk about proposed regulatory frameworks, you're like, that doesn't apply. Like, we will defend any federal regulatory framework that you could find reasons why it was bad, but unless your cards are specific to a federal regulatory framework, then that regulation won't happen when we vote pro. So instead of defending one piece of legislation, you're like, we'll defend any of the ideas in the proposed pieces of legislation as a good idea, even if they claim that they're a bad idea. And then if you're the con, you need to be ready to beat the pro if they get really specific or if they get not really specific. So if their case is predicated off of only one or two regulations, be prepared to define regulatory framework a lot more broadly and explain that they have to defend the most common, popular, like well-known version of regulations. And that is what your case should be about, so that you can say that you're disproving the whole topic and they're not proving the topic, they're proving one tiny example of the topic. And then if the pro's case is super generic and they won't defend any specific regulation, they're like, seeing as this is public forum, I don't have to provide a plan, and they won't give you any regulations at all, then you need to explain federal regulatory framework means nothing unless you give specifics. So if they won't defend what a federal regulatory framework is, voting pro passes nothing. It could pass anything. So if they won't defend any specific regulation, then they have to be ready to defend any regulation that you would want to criticize, because otherwise they could just defend nothing until they hear what you're critiquing and then switch their stance to defending something else, right? So if they're too specific, you can explain why that means they should lose. Or if they are not specific enough, you can explain why that means that they should lose, or that you should be allowed to read whatever you want and they can't skirt around it. The third overall, or the next prep approach, would be the contention of the offense level prep approach. Now, if your biggest tournament is like TOC or state or districts or national qualifiers or anything like that is on this topic, I would say right now, stop preparing the January China extraction topic. If you have cases and basic blocks and you don't need any more bids, stop preparing it now, use what you've got, and focus on preparing February. Because even though the January topic is huge, if it doesn't have any of your most important tournaments, you need the time to prepare for this topic more than you needed to prepare for January. I would suggest writing flex cases for when you're the second speaking team. What that means is that you adapt your case and what contentions you read based off of what the first speaking team reads, whether you're pro or con. This would require, because I have those 5 different kind of regulatory areas or the 5 different goals that regulatory frameworks that have been proposed seem to have. I would have a pro contention and a con contention on either side of each of those 5 regulatory frameworks. And so that way, if you are the second speaker and your opponents come up and their entire pro case, they're defending this topic is about regulations on advertising, you can read at least one contention that is specific to advertising, and not like it's an answer to their benefit, but that it is an argument that applies to the same topic. Essentially, you are preparing like a negative team does in policy debate, where the negative has to be ready to debate any specific plan under the topic, but they have generic arguments that would apply under every area of the topic. So in each round, you will read specific attacks to their specific regulations, but you should have a contention that generically responds to their version of whatever the regulatory framework they're defending is. But I would have that on the pro and on the con. So I'd have one pro and one con contention for marketing restrictions being good or bad, consumer safeguard restrictions being good or bad, sports integrity restrictions being good or bad, economic competition restrictions being good or bad, and unifying standards nationwide being good or bad. This means that you have at least one argument that clashes with their version of what the topic is. Because if you don't have any arguments about what they say the topic means, even if your case is true, it doesn't prove or disprove the topic, so you won't be able to win. So this guarantees that you always have some clash and that it's not 2 ships passing in the night. I think, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of debates where the pro says, we need a regulatory framework to protect consumers, and the con says, we need not to have a regulatory framework to make sure that things stay competitive. And those do not answer each other, and they're not even comparative, because these regulations wouldn't cause these problems if they were passed. So you don't want that to happen to you. I would also, as for when you're the first speaker, because the same thing could happen to you, you just don't get to adjust your case based off of what they say, I would prepare add-ons or overviews of each of those contentions that you write as shortened versions of them, so that you can start or end the rebuttal with like a 30 to 45 second version of the contention. That way, even if the second speaking team wins that their regulations that they say happen in the pro world is the correct way of viewing the topic, you have a new argument that will be able to outweigh them, even if they prove that your other arguments don't matter, or not my regulatory framework. My regulatory framework wouldn't do that. And that way you can still clash with them kind of no matter what the interpretation of what the pro world looks like. Last thing that I'll say about like the weird interpretations of the worlds: in policy, the negative never gets to tell the affirmative team what their world is. The negative can say, oh, that world isn't part of the topic, but the negative doesn't get to be like, this is what your plan does. But in public forum debate, because the con can go first and neither side is allowed to read a plan or counterplan, the con's vision of what the pro world would do and the pro's vision of what the pro world would do could be completely different things. And so the con is doing a two worlds analysis, but they're like, in the world where the pro passes these regulations, here's what they're like, this is what it looks like, and here's what the status quo looks like. The pro is then going to say, okay, well, if we pass these other regulations, let's compare that to the status quo. So it's almost like there's three worlds if you're not careful in this topic. There's what the pro thinks the regulatory framework would look like if it was passed, what the con thinks the regulatory framework would look like if it was passed, and the status quo. So you need to be prepared for having a contention that creates offense for you in your vision of what the pro world is and in their vision of what the pro world is and in both of your vision and what the status quo is. Lastly, we have the weighing or the comparative prep approach. This is where I think most lay debaters, if you're like, this is overwhelming, we have a 50-minute video for a 1 month long topic, I don't want to have to do all of this. I think this is where most people are going to default, and it can work if you do it on purpose and you're aware of the downsides. If you write a 2 or 3 contention case where every contention covers a completely different regulation area, and you are just prepared to say, we will defend whatever regulations you want to talk about, and we will defend any of the regulations that we've talked about, where you basically say, because the topic is so generic, any regulations mentioned in our case and any regulations mentioned in their case, let's assume that both of them would pass if you vote pro. And now we're just debating about, is the world where all of these regulations pass better than a world where they don't? And so maybe one contention is about advertising. One contention is about affordability. One contention is about antitrust, whether it's pro or con. And you need to be prepared to weigh the positive benefits of what the pro hopes the framework would include against the cons regulations that they are afraid that the regulatory framework would include, which is confusing because why, like if I'm like, hey, let's go to McDonald's, and someone else was like, well, I thought you were going to say, let's go to Burger King, so here's all my reasons why we shouldn't go to Burger King. Normally, none of those Burger King arguments would be able to defeat let's go to McDonald's argument. But because in public forum, we're not reading policies and you can't really read a plan, you're like, okay, well, I guess the overall topic was we should go get fast food. So we are prepared to defend all of the reasons why going to McDonald's is good, even if it also caused all of the reasons why going to Burger King would be bad, even though that originally we weren't planning on defending going to Burger King. I guess we'll still prove why that would be a good idea anyways. Essentially, you would be saying to the judge, we think that the benefits of a federal regulatory framework on sports betting that protects collegiate athletes are worth the costs of a regulatory framework that would harm advertising revenues. Or for the con, we think that the harms of a federal regulatory framework on sports betting that strengthens market competition isn't worth a federal regulatory framework that violates states' rights. So even if normally those could be two separate federal regulatory frameworks, for the sake of making this topic debatable without getting into policy territory, you just say whatever the pro thought the topic meant and whatever the con thought the topic meant, we're just going to smush them together and say, overall, is this worth this? If yes, vote pro. If not, vote con. Which means that not only do you need blocks at the truth level of just your argument is wrong to every single argument on the topic, you also need weighing analysis pre-prepared about why the regulation A policies benefits outweigh the cons of regulation D's policies, even if regulation A and D have nothing to do with each other. You need to be ready to weigh every argument you could read against every argument that the other side could read without relying on just their version of the topic is wrong. So chances are you need to be prepared to defend what your version of the topic looks like. You need to have at least one argument, whether it's a contention or a turn, on every version of what the topic could look like. And you need to be ready to say, even if we lose our version of what the topic looks like, we still can outweigh them on their version. Now let's talk about stakeholders. Who cares about this topic that I've been talking about for almost an hour? There's a lot of different groups that are affected by the outcome of this. We have gamblers and sports fans themselves. These regulations would likely impact them. We have the families and communities in which sports bettors live, athletes, officials, and coaches that are all involved in college and professional sports, sports leagues themselves, like the NBA or the NFL, and the coaches and the owners of the teams in those things. Sports books or the gambling companies, the sports betting companies themselves, but also state and local governments who have made these policies or who have passed these individual things or who have kept it illegal in the past or who have made deals. Now, what are the key areas of clash that you can count on? Because I'm worried that there's not going to be clash if pro says regulation area A is good and con says regulation area D is bad. What are you guaranteed to need to disagree on? Well, the biggest things are going to be, do we care more about consumer protection or individual freedom? Do we care about the freedom from being harmed or the freedom to do what you want? Freedom from is more on the pro, freedom to is more on the con. Then we have federal responsibility to protect its citizens versus states' rights to make its own decisions on its citizens' behalf. Pro is more on the federal side of things, con, state side of things. And then third, we have the sanctity of sports versus the stability of sports. Is betting getting like messing with the integrity, the purpose, the meaning, the value of sports, or is betting so essential to the monetary stability or the popularity of sports? And if nobody watches the sports, it doesn't matter if they have integrity or not, right? So I think the sanctity of sports is more on the pro side, the stability of sports is more on the con side. Finally, we are getting to pro and con arguments. Reasons why the FTC should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. We're going to talk about 10 of these. I'll probably go through these a little bit faster, but as always, the links to the slides will be in the video description. So first up, pro argument area number one is protecting players and coaches. Sports bettors are harassing and intimidating the athletes and coaches involved in the things that they bet on to try and psych them out or to put pressure on them to perform really well or to make them perform really badly so that if they have a prop bet on that specific person or on that team, that they can influence the outcome, right? And a federal regulatory framework could fix this by doing things like banning proposition bets on individual performances so that no one person can make or lose a person so much money that they feel like they need to go and harass them. You could also give better educational services provided by the FTC for student athletes to understand what sports betting is and how it impacts them and how to respond to those types of situations. And you could also fix the state by state loopholes where some states are allowing for people to get away with this harassment and not, getting banned from betting, and other places do ban them from betting. We could fix that kind of patchwork approach. This protects the mental and physical health of athletes and coaches while also maintaining the integrity of the game. Second pro argument area is reducing gambling addiction. Now, a lot of the pro and a lot of the con arguments could be grouped together under the same contention because they have very similar impacts, but they could each serve as different links to get you to the same impact, or they have different enough impacts that they could be read as separate contentions. So second up, we have reducing gambling addiction. Sports betting being legalized since 2018 has massively increased the number of Americans that are struggling with a gambling addiction, specifically for sports betting. And a federal regulatory framework could fix that by increasing funding and support and awareness of gambling recovery services, while also reducing the number of people that are being exposed to sports betting advertising or availability in the first place, which will improve mental health of U.S. citizens, reduce the economic strain and suffering for families from sports betting addiction, and it will also decrease potentially intimate partner violence and child abuse that skyrockets whenever a team wins or loses in an area with high frequency of sports betting. Third area is fighting predatory advertising. Now, these companies, these sports books, use extremely harmful and misleading advertising tactics to get more people to gamble on athletes. And a federal regulatory framework could include bans on advertising during certain times of day, eliminate deceptive terms like risk-free or no-sweat bets that manipulate people into thinking they're going to be fine. It could require that you always display the real winning odds on any advertising or on any platform before someone bets. You could be required to ban AI-enabled targeted betting opportunities so that people's data isn't being used against them to exploit them. You could mandate disclosures from influencers or celebrities or podcasts or other media things that have financial ties to sports books so that people don't just trust their favorite celebrity, that they know it's an ad and that they're not just saying they love it for no reason. And this is good because it would fight against the exploitation of citizens, it would improve transparency, and it would protect vulnerable populations. Fourth argument area for the pro would be improving financial security. Now, uniqueness or what's happening now, sports betting is super risky and is reducing the savings and spending power and just money that they have for everyday life of millions of Americans every single year, and that number is only getting bigger. Now, link, or how the topic would change this, a federal regulatory framework could impose required affordability checks before you're allowed to play anymore, limits on the amount of bets and the size of the bets that you can do per day. It could make it so that you can't put money from a credit card into being bet so that you don't go into debt. You can only bet money from your checking account or in cash. And it could also ban loss-inducing features that, prey on people who have lost a lot already, believing that they could get it all back. And then impact, why do we care? This would reduce the financial risks of sports betting, decrease the poverty among sports bettors, and also increase people's money to spend on other parts of the economy, which would be good. Fifth pro argument area is preserving sports integrity. Now, in the status quo or uniqueness, the fairness and objectivity of sports is being tainted by insider betting. From athletes are insider betting, coaches are insider betting, officials are insider betting, and it's changing the way that they act or how hard they try or the decisions that they make or the plays that they go for. And a federal regulatory framework could fix this by having a national data repository to track gambling data of expenses and transactions, so that when something seems sketchy, it'd be pretty easy to follow the numbers. You could impose criminal penalties for fraud and obstruction to deter people, make them feel like it's not worth the risk of changing my behavior or betting on my own game, or helping people bet on my game by, losing on purpose or making this call for this team on purpose. You could also eliminate latency advantages, where people who are there in person get an advantage over people that are betting online, because it takes a couple of seconds before things get transmitted digitally. You could also ban prop betting to eliminate individual pressure on athletes, where athletes wouldn't feel so pressured to, win or lose if their specific performance wasn't the thing that people were going to win or lose money on, and instead it was just the team. This will protect the integrity of athletics, make consumers perceive sports more positively, make sports more popular or avoid losing customers, and it will also reduce the amount of lawsuits and scandals that have happened in professional and collegiate sports leagues. Sixth pro argument area is about holding state governments accountable. Right now, we lack a federal regulatory framework, which means every state government is, a land of the flies, gets to do whatever they want, and there's not really anyone that checks on them if they're being sketchy. A federal regulatory framework would make it so that we have a floor, that every state has to have at least this minimum level of regulation, and then they can go beyond it if they want to. There could be a national data house that all of the states have to report to, so that we could, keep them accountable and make sure that they're following their own rules and their own laws. The national self-exclusion list rather than a state-by-state exclusion list, where if somebody says, don't let me bet at all anymore, or if somebody gets banned, there could be a national sports betting ban rather than just a state-by-state one. You could require that states apply to be allowed to have legalized sports betting in their state, which could have really strict regulations to prevent all of the problems that the pro talks about. You could improve sports books reporting data transparency, make it so that they have to be more clear to state governments, federal government, to consumers about the data that they collect and what they do with it. All of this is good because it would reduce misconduct, improve law enforcement exercises, and uphold the federal government's duty to protect its citizens. Seventh pro argument area is combating market consolidation. Now, nearly all of the sports betting industry is dominated by just two companies, FanDuel and DraftKings, with very little to no room for small businesses or alternative choices for consumers. But a federal regulatory framework or voting pro could solve this, as the Federal Trade Commission could then investigate and prosecute anti-competitive practices of FanDuel and DraftKings. Basically, even though they were denied a merger acting like the same company, they could get them to stop. And they also have been probably doing things, or allegedly doing things, like pressuring vendors, payment processors, and major sports leagues, kind of like what Ticketmaster does with concert sales, to basically prevent all of the people who do sports, like have the sports in their areas, or who televise the sports. They might be mob bossing them into not working with small platforms, and the FTC could stop that. This would improve betting odds, where if you only have two companies to choose from for your sports betting and you're addicted, they can make the odds as bad for you as they want. Whereas a smaller betting company could be like, hey, we'll make your odds slightly better and slightly cheaper so that you'll come gamble with us, even if our profit is slightly less. Basically, by creating competition for sports bettors, the quality of services would be better, the prices would go down, and the market would be more stable. Because right now, with only two companies holding up the entire industry, one of them collapses, the entire industry collapses. Eighth pro argument area is protecting minors. No federal oversight means that it's been very hard to stop minors from betting on sports and from having their own competitive performances even before college being bet on. But a federal framework could establish a national betting age, mandate age verification processes nationwide, enforce curfews of advertisements of when they're allowed to be played or not, require different leagues to provide clean game broadcasts so that there have to be options to watch with no gambling advertisements. They could ban blurred advertising, which you can look more into, where it's basically putting advertisements for sports gambling into things that have nothing to do with sports, like video games or mobile games, in universe or in movies, for example. You could also ban gambling on sporting events where minors are playing as part of your regulatory framework. And this would all reduce the financial struggles of teens and young adults. It could make them learn more or pay better attention in school or be less likely to drop out and have better focus. Their brain would probably develop better when they're not getting these dopamine hits and rushes from the addicted brain of sports betting, and their mental health would likely improve. Ninth, we have safeguarding consumer data. Right now, sportsbooks require highly sensitive identifying data and financial details from their bettors in order for you to be allowed to use their platform. But they use all of this sensitive data that they collect on you or that they mandate from you to then train their algorithms to maximize and know your exact pressure points of how to get you back on, of how to get you to bet more. Basically, your For You page, but instead of just trying to get you to watch a video or watch an advertisement, give them your money directly. And there's no real federal oversight of this data, of how it's collected, of what it's used for, of how the algorithms work. But a federal regulatory framework could ban deceptive data policies and unfair algorithm manipulation to protect consumers. It could require robust and uniform across the states collection methods, protection standards, and improve the investigative tools for law enforcement when they need to use this data to go in and find examples of fraud or protect people from identity theft, which is the impact of this is preventing identity theft and fraud, reducing exploitation, and improving public trust in sports betting companies. 10th and finally, for the pro, we have promoting interstate cooperation. Now, this is less of an argument about why sports betting is bad and more of a reason why leaving it to the states is bad. So the Federal Wire Act and Murphy versus NCAA left everything on sports betting in the Wild West up to the states, which led to things being really confusing, very different across the states, unequal, unfair, different regulations, different requirements. But it also means that interstate cooperation is pretty much impossible, and you can't have interstate transfers because of the Murphy Act or because of the Federal Wire Act. But a federal regulatory framework could sync up the laws on minimum age and prop betting bans, or preventing people from traveling across state lines to get around rules. It could create a national self-exclusion list. It could simplify registration, licensing, and taxing requirements and procedures so that companies could get registered in every state instead of having to apply a completely different registration and licensing process in every state that they want to operate. It could amend the FWA to allow for interstate sports betting transfers. It could improve cooperation via a national sports data house that all the states contribute to. So all of this would basically be good because the market conditions for the United States of America for sports betting businesses would improve, enabling economic growth, promoting fairness across geographic lines, and improving the efficiency and integrity of the legal and judicial system rather than making it so that you have to know you need a different lawyer in every single different state if you want to start one of these companies right now. So now that you've heard some reasons why we should create a regulatory framework, what are some reasons why we should not create a federal regulatory framework at the FTC? First up, we have good old federalism. Very generic argument, hard to win on the impact level, easy to win on the link level, but more persuasive, I think, in front of lay judges and conservative judges. And it is all about violating states' rights and federal overreach. So Murphy versus NCAA legalized sports betting on a national level because it was saying that the federal government doesn't have the authority to make decisions on this, only interstate betting. But in the state, that's up to the state governments. And so the Constitution was being violated, so they took away the federal law and left it up to the states. A new federal regulatory framework would violate states' rights in a lot of ways. It would possibly force them to apply to have the thing that they've already legalized through the federal government. It would blur the responsibility of whose job is it to enforce these different rules and regulations of sports betting laws. It would shift all of these regulatory costs. The federal government would put all these things in place, but then the states would be the ones who have to foot the bill of enforcing them. It would impose a one-size-fits-all approach on all of the states that doesn't account for their individual states' needs. And the impact, this is unconstitutional, or violating the Constitution is bad and sets a bad precedent, or it would reduce interstate competition and innovation, where when every state does it differently, this state tries plan A, this state tries plan B. When plan A goes better than plan B, then plan B will eventually switch. But if everybody has to follow the same standard and it doesn't work, nobody's trying new things. It would also make the legal landscape for sports betting really confusing and complex for state legislatures, because they would have to figure out which of their laws are gone now, which of their laws they have to update, which of their laws they can keep, which of their laws are contradictory, and it would be very confusing. Second con argument area is similar, but it's more about the money than the laws. 80% of states have legalized sports betting and are benefiting from the economic activity and taxes that come from that industry. But a federal regulatory framework could basically force states to completely redo their own regulatory frameworks, which would massively increase costs at the state level. It would increase the cost of enforcing laws and reporting data for companies as well. It would harm the economic value or profitability of the sports betting industry. It would force a reallocation of tax revenues and budgets that have already been preset and determined, and they can't print money like the federal government can. And if anything, it would just encourage their citizens, instead of going through legalized sports betting, where the state government is going to get some of the money, to just go back to doing illegal sports betting in offshore accounts where none of the money is going to get taxed or go through the local economy, which would be bad. This will harm the budgets of state governments, reduce funding for social programs, or require states to increase taxes, while harming the local economies that would have been benefiting from these sports betting companies and reducing overall economic activity and circulation of currency. The third con argument area is the Federal Trade Commission overstretch argument. Sounds like a policy debate disadvantage. And it basically says that the FTC is hanging on by a thread right now because the Trump administration has gutted it, and it has a lot of goals and priorities, and it's barely getting those things done. And it needs to focus all of what little it has on those priorities. But a new federal regulatory framework for sports betting, established and overseen by the FTC, would take away a ton of limited financial and labor resources that would be going to other projects like antitrust enforcement, made in the USA advertising enforcement, holding big tech accountable, protecting minors online, prohibiting illegal telemarketing practices. All of those are things that are currently within the strategic plan for 2026 through 2027 of the FTC, of things that it wants to focus on. And it would likely have to shift resources away from any of those things to the sports betting stuff. And you could argue that those things are more important. Or that the FTC trying to do all of it at the same time would mean that none of it would get done, and it's better for these other priorities to get done and still leave sports betting unregulated than it would be to say that the FTC is going to do the regulation, but they're not actually capable of it. So this is kind of a solvency argument, because the FTC won't even be capable of enforcing this or doing this. But also, if they do become capable of it, then they won't be capable of taking care of all these other priorities, harming businesses, enabling monopolization, exploiting consumers, and leaving minors at risk online. Fourth con argument area is increasing court clog. Again, another very policy debate sounding argument. But right now, the federal government has stayed out for the most part of sports betting since the 2018 decision, which means that judicial oversight over individual cases is being left up to state courts rather than federal courts. But a federal regulatory framework for sports betting means that the FTC is going to have to go after more and more sports betting companies. So they're going to be doing lawsuits. More people can complain to the FTC about sports betting stuff and get lawsuits on their behalf. The federal government, because there might be interstate things now, will have to step in when there's disputes between this state and this state. There will be mass repeals of laws that had been existing that will get the states sued. And there will be backlash to the federal government and things like that, right? People will call the federal regulatory framework unconstitutional. And even if the pro fiats that it definitely passes, they can't fiat that it doesn't have to go through the court first, all of which will stretch the already underfunded, understaffed courts beyond their capacity, which means that there will be legal and administrative fees increasing and hurting spending overall. It will reduce the amount of scrutiny that can be applied to each case, because there's so many more of them that you either have to move through them really quickly, or it will take so long to get to the proceedings that you're delaying justice for people who deserve it now. And justice delayed is justice denied. Fifth argument area is decreasing sports viewership and attendance. Now, sporting events make their money because people go and because people watch. And it's higher and more popular than ever, largely because of sports bettings. Because people before would only watch their own team's games or their own home team's games, or only if it was, their favorites. But now, if you're betting on all these companies, not just your favorites, you want to tune in to watch all of the games, not just the ones that you personally care about for your own fan self. But a federal regulatory framework could reduce the advertising deals that they're allowed to make with sports betting companies, which would hurt the leagues. It would reduce the incentives and the advertising for sports bettors to jump in and start betting on games. So they're not going to watch anymore because they don't realize or they can't make as much money off of each individual game. It will also fragment audiences because if some of them are watching the clean broadcast versus some are watching the not clean broadcast, then that means that each individual broadcasting company is making less and less money. So it's not as profitable to have to do a broadcast that you can't show advertisements on. So eventually they'll just all disappear. It could reduce the engagement from sports watchers to going back to just watching their favorite teams and their favorite players, all of which will decimate the popularity of viewing and going to sporting events, which means that there will be lower ticket sales, lower television ratings, decreasing the amount of money that the sports leagues get, which means that they have less wages overall for paying their athletes, their coaches, their referees. The quality of the streaming products or of what you get to see in person would go down, and there'd be fewer options for getting to view games as fans. Sixth con argument area is increasing costs for consumers. Now, sports viewing and even sports betting, if you are careful, can be a really low cost but accessible way of having entertainment for Americans across the country when the economy is not doing great right now. But if you have a federal regulatory framework for sports betting, it's going to make that hobby, that pastime, way more expensive because now the compliance costs that they have to pay will have to be of these new companies will get passed on to consumers. They'll increase the VIG, they'll increase the transaction fees, they'll increase the ticket sales, they'll increase the streaming packages deals. Consumers are going to have to find a way to make up the money that sports leagues used to get from advertising for these sports betting companies. If they can't get the money from the advertising companies anymore, they're going to charge it to consumers. There might be more taxes that have to be paid on each individual bet, which means that companies will make up the lost money that people are spending on the tax portion by increasing the regular portion. Maybe there won't be allowed to have micro bet transactions anymore. So every bet you want to do costs more money than it used to, which is supposed to make it riskier. So you don't want to bet as often, but instead, if people are addicted, they're going to bet anyways. So now they have to spend even more of their money than they would have before. All in all, it's going to make watching sports, attending sports, and betting on sports more expensive for consumers, increasing the inflation of those costs, reducing the overall consumer spending power for other areas of the economy, decreasing the amount of money that they have on saving, and making you more likely to slip into poverty or financial ruin if you are addicted. Seventh is hurting economic security, mostly of the businesses involved. So right now, sportsbooks, businesses, casinos, and even professional sports bettors are getting their economic stability. They're getting their jobs. They're getting their profits. They're getting their savings off of sports betting. But a federal regulatory framework could massively disrupt their economic stability by spooking investors. Who's going to want to invest in these sports betting companies now that it's not going to be as profitable or as easy to make money, which means that their stock values are going to plummet. And also the patronage of the casinos, people who go to do the betting in person, people aren't going to go as often anymore if it's not as accessible or if it's not getting advertised to them or they don't know that it exists, which is going to hurt the casino's money. And then people who are professional gamblers will have fewer opportunities, fewer options, fewer places, worse odds, and more expensive bets for sports betting. So all of these groups of people's economic stability is going to be hurt, which means that people are going to lose, their stock investments. They're going to lose their retirement accounts. There's going to be massive layoffs and job losses from these big sports betting companies and from casinos, and professional gamblers are going to lose the livelihoods or the things that they're doing to take care of themselves. Eighth con argument area is harming college athletics. Now, sports betting, even though individual college athletes might not be able to bet on other college athletes, and even if college athletes don't get paid, sports betting is helping the money in the world of college athletics by increasing attendance and viewerships of the college games, which is how they get their budgets and how they get their money. They're getting more revenues for their sports programs because college sports teams and leagues can make deals with big sports betting companies to get, advertising revenues. And also individual players through proposition betting. If a player is making people a lot of money, that makes that player more popular, which makes that player more valuable, which gives them tools to ask for more money in scholarships or to try and get traded to a better university. But a federal regulatory framework on sports betting could devastate college athletes and athletics in general by making it less popular, by banning prop bets on college athletes or by banning betting on college athletics in general, which means that if it's getting watched less or attended less, they're getting less money. Sports books couldn't advertise anymore at college events under some regulatory frameworks, which means that they would lose those deals. So they'd lose that money for their budget. And individual players would lose this tool to make them more popular, taking away destroy their bargaining power to advocate for themselves to get better treatment, better scholarships, better trades, all of which will strain college sports programs, which means that there's less money for coaching, less money for facilities, less money for scholarships, less money in college athletics, and less opportunities overall. Ninth argument area is violating tribal sovereignty. Now, Native American tribes operate sports betting services that are crucial for their economic well-being, in addition to other gambling services as well. And a federal regulatory framework for sports betting could infringe upon the sovereignty and autonomy of these tribes by forcing them to follow the same regulations that were given to the states. And even if the pro says, well, we wouldn't make them follow it, okay, cool, then you can't solve. Or even if you won't make the tribes follow it, most tribes have made agreements in places where there are tribes that offer gambling services in states that have legalized sports betting. They have made deals that rely upon the state's laws. So if the state has to change their laws, even if the federal government doesn't require the tribe to follow the new laws, the states will have to completely redo their partnerships with the tribes, which will inevitably hurt them. This would impact and destroy a crucial source of funding, revenue, and job opportunities that sports betting is creating for indigenous tribes. And it is a further example and a further entrenchment of the federal government's colonial exploitation and occupation of native groups that live on this land. Lastly, we have increasing cybersecurity risks. Now, in the status quo, data for sports betting is very decentralized because every state does it differently. Every company has to follow different rules and regulations in every single state, and there's no interstate betting, there's no interstate data sharing requirements. So if you want everybody who works under a certain company's data, it's very difficult to get with one successful cyber attack, right? But a federal regulatory framework would mean that sports betting companies are going to have increased data collection, increased reporting requirements. It's going to be confusing about whose job it is to do what or enforce what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do between the state governments over data collection and protection. And it's going to make it more attractive if we create this one federal national database that has all of this gambling data from across the country. It's going to be very attractive to hackers to try and hack that one database versus when it was all decentralized. And even if they are never successful, all of those cyber attacks will drain resources and require increased spending at the federal and state level and even company level for cybersecurity. It's going to increase spending on consumer data privacy lawsuits because when there are inevitably data losses, or if the federal government says that companies have to do all these things and people want to say, well, you didn't do that, so give me money, there's going to be more lawsuits. And there's going to be more civilians that are exposed to having their data hacked or stolen through a cyber attack at the federal level. We are near the end of this video. I just have a couple of final thoughts of things that I think you should keep in mind when you are debating this topic. Number one, it's very important to remember that every single one of your arguments needs to make it clear what your vision of what is happening now as a result of state regulations or lack thereof, or lack of federal regulations. What is happening now? How would a federal regulatory framework change laws or change how the world operates to solve that problem or to cause a problem? And then why should we care? That uniqueness link impact structure is very important for this topic making sense, especially the link level, tying it to examples of specific regulations, specific bills, specific things that the FTC has done with other industries, specific things that other countries have tried and whether or not they've worked. All of those examples are going to be very important. You also need to just be very well read on this topic. You're going to need to do a lot of background research to be ready to debate this in a way that will make sense no matter what your opponents say or what your judge knows. Read the Federal Trade Commission Act, at least sections 5 and 18. Read the different federal bills that have been proposed in the past couple of years for regulating sports betting so that you have an idea of what federal regulatory framework means off the top of your head or what your opponents should and shouldn't be debating. Read states' individual regulations that they currently have or don't have and see how different it is so that you can pull out your specific state's examples, because local lay judges will love hearing in Idaho, blah, 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 or in Utah, blah, blah, blah. You should also be prepared to debate about the FTC itself. I don't understand fully why this was just the FTC and not the United States federal government. I think it should have just been a United States federal government topic so that we don't have to worry about any, solvency deficits or agent counterplan type arguments. But you have to defend as the pro that the FTC is capable and sufficient or good enough as an actor that they will be able to solve the problems that you talk about with these regulations that they enforce. The con needs to be ready to say, no, the FTC won't work. It can't do these regulations. It's not going to be effective at it. The FTC isn't enough. So be ready to defend them or attack them. Next, just because this sounds like, looks like, and is written like a policy topic doesn't mean that it needs to be debated that way. You can't read a plan, you can't read a counterplan, and the con can speak first. So the pro has to defend the resolution as a general principle, and the con has to disagree with the resolution as a general principle. Reading contentions that are hyper-specific to one regulation is not going to work in front of the majority of judges at the majority of tournaments. Even if all of your examples come from one bill or from one regulation, that might be a problem. So it might not be enough to affirm or negate, because in policy, you can affirm through proving one specific plan, and you can negate the entire resolution by negating that one specific plan. Doesn't work like that in public forum. So you need to be ready to explain why the benefits of your vision of the pros regulations outweigh the harms of their vision of the pros regulations, and vice versa. Unless you can win your very specific definition of a federal regulatory framework, but the cards are not good for that. So you either have to be very ready to win on topicality in a way that nobody else is prepared for, or very ready to win no matter what they say the topic is, your vision of the topic, or outweigh no matter what their vision of the topic is. There are going to be a lot of examples on this topic. There are going to be examples from different states, different types of sports, different Federal Trade Commission actions. What have other countries done with sports betting? What have other industries been done when we've regulated them? You should try and have a variety of examples. Don't rely on just one company, one sport, one state. You need examples for every argument you want to make, but examples themselves are not arguments. If the entire contention is an example, you have not proven the topic true or false. You have proven an example true. And you don't need to try and defeat every single one of your opponent's examples. If other people try to do that, great. Replace them with a new example, or say the logic of the argument is still true. They've defeated one instance of this argument's truth occurring in the real world. But if we win that the logic of our argument is true, there will be other examples that haven't even happened yet where the same thing happens. So don't focus on defeating the examples, focus on defeating the logic of the arguments and using examples to prove the logic of your arguments, not as the logic of your arguments. Lastly, I want to say good luck to everybody at national qualifiers, regional or district tournaments, state championship tournaments, the TOC, all of those types of things. I know that every state has different times, but February is a very important month for a lot of different people. And I do think this was the better topic. I do think that I'm glad that this got picked over the other topic for a lot of reasons, but I think it's going to be tough. I think it's a very prep intensive topic for a 1 month long resolution, which can be very good for debate at the highest level with the hardest workers, but your regular everyday locals, the barrier to entry to this one's pretty high. So be nice to your opponents. Not everybody's going to see this video. Not everybody has coaching. Not everybody has briefs. Not everybody gets to go to camp. Not everybody is even a member of the NSTA. Not everybody got to do debate since the time they're in middle school. Some people are novices. Some people are senior novices. I say all of this to say, you might have a very specific definition in your mind, even after watching this video, on what the topic should be about. But because of how it was written, you have to acknowledge that everybody comes to debate with a different set of skills, knowledge, background, experiences, and resources. Their vision of the topic might be the one that just made sense to them. And if you try to exclude them from even having a chance to participate in the debate because they didn't understand this hyper-specific regulation that you wanted, that's not going to create the type of community that you want to be in. And you need opponents to want to keep doing debate for debate to continue to exist. So be ready to defend what you think the topic should be, but not to the point where you would rather not debate your opponent at all than debate their vision of the topic's meaning. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for sticking around with this. I know that this was a long one. I hope that it's helpful. I hope that it sparks a conversation. If you have questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, things that I missed or things that I misunderstood or that you think about differently, have that conversation down in the comments and I'll do my best to respond. And I wish you the best of luck in February. I will see you next time.